The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. This week we're talking with Fiona Coffey. She's the author of Political Acts, Women in Northern Irish Theatre 1921 to 2012. She has a PhD in drama from Tufts University and a Master's of Philosophy from Trinity College in Dublin. She teaches Irish Cultural Studies and Theatre History at Quinnipiac University. Fiona, congratulations on the new book, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I think most of our listeners know something about the Troubles, the 20th century conflict in Northern Ireland. But could you perhaps just fill us in a little bit, especially with regards to how this political turmoil affected theater and where women fit into the sort of political and social issues of the Troubles?
Sure. Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting about Northern Irish theater is what you're talking about, this context of the Troubles. I think that historically, Northern Irish theater has really been marginalized within the Irish theatrical canon. There really has been a focus on theater from the Republic. And part of that is because of this sort of sustained conflict that has not allowed a whole lot of proliferation of theater to develop naturally in the North. So the forms have really been restricted. There was a lot of censorship in the North over the types of theater that could be brought in. There's a lot of British imports being brought over from England, British actors, and there was not a whole lot of indigenous theater being developed in the North at the same time that this really wonderful and rich sort of history of theater that was being developed in the Republic and in the Free State. And I think another important difference between theater from the Republic and Northern theater as well, and which also I think contributes to this sort of marginalization of Northern drama, is this very strong history that theater from the Republic has of being attached to both Irish nationalism, the establishment of the Irish Free State, the sort of rejection of colonialism and the British rule over the Ireland, and this very strong cultural sense that Irish drama and the formation of the Abbey Theatre at the turn of the century really helped formulate a strong sense of Irish identity. And then in contrast to the North, the North never has been able to throw off those shackles of British rule. There's still this very complex political situation. There was many decades during the Troubles of intense violence going on. And so theater in that way has been shaped very, very specifically by these intense and very specific historical and political circumstances, as well as restricted in a lot of different ways. And in terms of women specifically, women in a lot of ways were similarly restricted in the North in a large part because of this continued and sustained conflict. So feminism and the women's movements, while they were much more prevalent and developed in a much more natural way in the Republic, again, the Troubles really sort of helped delay and postpone a lot of those ideas and a lot of the sort of the need for both Protestant and Catholic women to come together to create a strong women's movement in the North was really inhibited by the sectarian divisions over there, which sort of dominated the sectarian politics and identity politics. And so all that goes to show sort of women's involvement in theater, women's relationship to theater in the North, and Northern theater in general has a very different historical and political and cultural sensibility than that from the South.
Yeah, I was particularly struck in reading the introduction to your book. You've spoken to many of the playwrights, many of the theater practitioners from the late 20th, early 21st century, and a lot of them said, well, we don't really want to be labeled as feminist per se.
Yeah, that was a very fascinating situation because I went over there initially saying, women in Northern theater have really been marginalized. Nobody's talking about them. There's nobody who's done a really comprehensive study of who these people are and what their contributions were within the larger, Irish theatrical canon. And then when I went up and started interviewing playwrights and actresses and directors, many of the contemporaries up there had a very hard time wanting me to both include them in a study that was specific to gender. So the idea of being grouped in with other women writers was off-putting to them. They felt like it was a ghettoization of their work. They just wanted to be compared to any and every playwright. They didn't want to be a quote-unquote woman playwright. They weren't writing quote-unquote women's plays. They were just writers, and they wanted to be treated as such. And then in addition to that, there was a very strong sense that the ideologies and the politics surrounding feminism was very, they really distanced themselves. Many of them said they didn't want to be called a feminist. And so it was very complex trying to write a book in which many of the women didn't feel comfortable with some of the lenses I was using to look at their work, or a lot of their work spoke to or had many feminist impulses in it, and were clearly looking at very interesting gender dynamics, but they did not want to be labeled as such. And a large part of this, the dislike of gendered feminism, again, comes from this very complex historical and political situation in the North. And there's been this very sort of historical association of feminism within Irish nationalism. And so for Protestant women, that has made them distance themselves from the word feminism. And then also, I think there's also been ways of the different sectarian ideologies of nationalism and unionism and republicanism and loyalism really sort of attacked a lot of the women's movement and feminist movement, and really downplayed them and tried to kind of break that up because they wanted the predominant political model and this sort of dominant binary of saying, doesn't matter if you're male or female, what primarily matters is if you're Catholic or Protestant, right? If you're pro-British or you're anti-British. Those were the split that was supposed to be your dominant sense of core identity. So a sense of women's rights, a sense of feminist impulses were often kind of pushed down. So it's very complex, and there's a lot of really interesting different historical and political reasons why people continue to be so uncomfortable with the idea of gender and the idea of feminism in the North. And so that was a very interesting kind of lens to be looking at within these plays, given that history.
So the Troubles themselves, the sort of proper political series of events that we talk about when we talk about the Troubles, are mostly from the late 20th century, but this theatrical culture and this political conflict didn't come out of nowhere. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the earlier 20th century figures that you write about in your book? Characters like Alice Milligan, who's particularly interesting.
Yeah, Alice Milligan is a really interesting figure. She was a playwright, she was an actress and a director, and she was also a really important political figure. And she was unique in that she was a Northern Protestant, but she was also a feminist nationalist. So she was a Northern Protestant who was very, very pro home rule, getting the British out of Ireland, uniting the country, making sure that the country or that the island in particular was united. And she spent a lot of time traveling very extensively all over the island, performing these highly political tableaux vivants, right, the living pictures. And she would often use these sort of, she'd use a lot of allegory and a lot of Irish mythology. And she would bring in local politicians, and she'd travel to small towns and bring in prominent members of the town and have them all integrate with her actors on the stage. And really advocate not only for women's rights, but also for, a strong sense of Irish cultural identity, as well as Irish independence. And she was very prolific. She also wrote a series of political journals and literary journals, which she edited, and she wrote a million plays and had them published in all these little local newspapers as a way to disseminate her small kind of playlets in a way that was inexpensive, that local community groups could have access to these plays. So publishing them in these local newspapers was a really wonderful way to disseminate her ideas and to sort of proliferate her theater that was then being performed by these sort of small community groups across the island. And she ultimately was a very early example of a Northern woman in theater who really believed that theater and performance should be harnessed for political change. And there was a very direct relationship between those two things. And throughout the book, the women that I look at and the sort of history of political activism and theater is very, very strong in the North. And that is a story that really has not been told yet. And I think that the Republic of Ireland is usually given most of the credit of linking Irish drama to the establishment of the Irish Free State, to the Abbey Theatre, to establishing a strong sense of Irish cultural identity, and that has not been looked at as closely in the North. And there is this really wonderful and strong links between politics and theater and women in the North.
Jumping forward a few decades, some of these playwrights that you write about really begin to emerge in the 1980s. Now we're well into the period identified as the Troubles. You get figures like Anne Devlin, Christina Reed, and organizations like the Charabanc Theatre. What's going on in the 80s? Who are some of these figures? What do they represent in terms of a change?
Yeah, so the 1980s really explodes as a very, very strong time for women in the North. And one of the theater companies that you mentioned, the Charabanc Theater Company, which ends up touring all over the island, both North and South, really becomes one of the most well-respected, politically active theater companies in all of the island. So for the first time, the North becomes a bastion of strong theater, respected theater coming out of the North, not just the South. And so that's a big deal. And you also have the Field Day Theater Company during the same period, led by Brian Friel and Tom Pollan and some other important Irish playwrights and actors. But that is primarily male-based. And so what's wonderful about Charabanc is that they were an all-female theater company. They were community-based. It was made up of both Protestant and Catholic women. And they toured around and went to a lot of places that didn't have access to theater. And they listened to the stories of the community, and they devised these very kind of rough, little agitprop type of theater that was easy to tour, but that reflected the voices of the women in their communities and specifically looked at the experience of living through the Troubles from a woman's perspective. So what is it like to, be a woman when your husband and your brother and your son are all in prison? Or what is it like to try to live through a day making a meal and trying to attend to your children when there are bombs exploding around you and when the police keep raiding your home? So it was a point of view that really hadn't been looked at before, and that was really groundbreaking in terms of them touring this perspective throughout the island. And Christina Reed and Anne Devlin also were important figures during this time, publishing and performing. They did more sort of standard typical plays that were performed at well-established theaters. And they also helped establish a very strong reputation during the 1980s that women in the North were producing important, politically relevant theater.
As early as the turn of the 20th century, plays from Northern Ireland sort of appear distinct from their Southern counterparts. At one point you quote the critic W.B. Reynolds, who identifies early 20th century Northern drama as, quote, dry, satiric, and darkly comedic. There are some really interesting formal differences that you identify with this Northern drama as opposed to some of what we might be more familiar with from Southern Ireland. You point out that it's more ensemble-focused. It's often, you mentioned agitprop in your previous answer, less focused on coming from a single playwright, more focused on letting in multiple voices and not working in the sort of framework of the well-made play, the well-plotted, familiar kind of melodrama that you often see at the theater. What is different? I know I just laid out a bunch of stuff that you write about, but what is different about these plays? What is maybe unexpected if you don't know anything about Northern Irish drama, particularly by female playwrights and creators? What stands out about it?
Yeah. I think certainly all the things you listed are very important characteristics. But I think from an audience's perspective, and there have certainly been cases where audiences from the Republic who are not as used to seeing theater from the North have had some negative reactions to it because certain theater from the North, certainly not all, but a lot of theater from the North does tend to have this a little rougher, very unsentimental view of the world. It can be sharp, it can be biting, it can be very satiric. There can be some very uncomfortable comedy or humor in it that has a very sort of dark undertone to it. A lot of the theater also tends to deal with violence in some ways because of just the North's strong history and complicated history with it. And, violence in turn, not only just physical violence, but emotional violence, psychological violence, just the different ways that one's life is affected by a very long, sustained conflict. And that kind of perspective and psychology that is only formulated by this very complex history it really kind of bleeds into the theater that is being produced up there. That really makes it distinctive from the Republic, which just frankly has had a very different history than the North in a lot of ways.
So we've been talking so much about politics and feminism and how people do or don't identify with the sort of different political categories or gender categories that we tend to assign to them. What's going on now in Northern Irish theatre? How are certain artists, playwrights challenging some of these categories?
Yeah, so recently there's been sort of a move. So the peace process starts basically officially in 1998 with the signing of the Belfast Agreement. And it's sort of very interesting to see what type of theater starts to emerge as you sort of move further into the peace process. And one of the things that is a little bit of an interesting paradox between theater that's being produced during the Troubles versus theater that is being produced during the peace process is there is a sense of I think sort of instability during the peace process. I think there is a sense of pessimism that is really permeating a lot of these plays. And so you'll see in terms of the form and structure, some of these plays are using non-traditional techniques, experimental techniques, I think, to reflect that sense, which I'll talk about in a second. But one of the really interesting things is I think during the 1980s, especially with women's theater, although you're at during the 80s and the 90s, you're sort of at the height of a lot of this violence and conflict and a lot of the despair. Many of the plays are very funny. They're very optimistic. There is a sense that that the community is going to come together and protect. There is a sense of that women's bonding and women's connections to each other can keep each other safe and whole and uplift each other. Versus when you get into the peace process, there's a real lack of positive community sense. There's a real lack of women helping women. There's a lot more negative images of motherhood, of being a wife. And it's sort of a very interesting and somewhat paradox sense of, once you sort of get into this sort of peace process point, you'd think, oh, there'd be like a relief, or we'd be a little bit more optimistic about the future, or people would have the space and the time to care more about the women's movement or women's rights or things. And you actually see a little bit of the reverse of that, a tightening of strict gender roles, a tightening and a restriction of what women are being allowed to do professionally, sexually, all these different aspects. And so that has been a really interesting look at some of the theater that's being produced recently. And then in terms of the form and structure, you are getting these very interesting immersive theater pieces. You're getting a lot of site-specific type of work. as well as work that is multimedia, introducing different sort of forms and structures into different spaces. So really moving away again from the well-made play or the proscenium arch play.
And who are some of these figures? You write about a couple of particularly interesting ones. I believe Shannon Yee is one of them.
Yeah, Shannon Yee is a really interesting figure because she represents a new level of diversity that's come to the North. So especially with a lot of the stabilization in the North and some of the strong sort of financial and global economic development that happened before the global financial collapse, the North really was starting to change and a lot of immigrants were coming in. And Shannon Yee is an American-born playwright. She's Chinese-American. She moved to the North to be with her partner. So she's also, while she was in the North, she actually suffered from brain trauma. She essentially was like at a nightclub one night dancing and having a great time. She woke up the next morning and she had collapsed in the nightclub. She was in the hospital intensive care unit and had a brain infection that was very severe. And so one of her theater pieces that's very interesting is looking at the process of her recovery from a traumatic brain injury and using binaural radio technology and sound technology to help create this sort of immersive experience for her audience. And it's a one-on-one theater experience where an individual audience member puts on the earphones and has basically a one-on-one theater experience with understanding Shannon's recovery. So she's a very interesting example of a level of diversity. She and her partner, Grania Close, were the first couple to have a legal civil union in all of the UK. A BBC documentary actually filmed that experience. So she is somebody who represents diversity in a lot of different ways, being an immigrant, being gay, having a disability with the brain trauma, and also just being a very kind of experimental artist, doing a lot of new things out there and bringing in a lot of kind of new work that the North may not have seen before.
Fiona Coffey's new book is Political Acts, Women in Northern Irish Theatre, 1921 to 2012. It comes out from Syracuse University Press. We'll have more information about that in the show notes. Fiona, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's been a real pleasure.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.